as I can remember, I've been obsessed with reading and writing. I remember being a young child, probably 10 or 11 years old, and my grandpa bought me a first edition of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and I was hooked from then on. When the Deathly Hallows finally released, I read it all in a single sitting, cover to cover. And as I got older, that transitioned into me creating my own worlds, my own stories. That's part of why I love being a dungeon master so much, creating my own worlds and characters and telling the stories I have up in here. It's a goal of mine one day to perhaps write a novel. I think that'd be amazing. It's definitely one of the things I've always wanted to do. I've tried to start many times, but I've never been successful at it. So when I was sitting here the other day at my desk, wondering what should I do a video about, thought I have a lot of days. I remembered a story I wrote some time ago that I am very fond of. This is a story that I wrote my freshman year of community college, all the way back in 2019. And it was a creative writing assignment, and there were 2 rules for this assignment. It had to be at least 10 pages. Okay? Excuse me, there were 3 rules. At least 10 pages. We had to be inspired by the works of a famous author. I chose H.P. Lovecraft. And we had to reference our most recently played song on Spotify. So, the song that I had most recently been listening to was Gypsy by Fleetwood Mac, and being inspired by H.P. Lovecraft, one of my favorite authors and world builders, I wrote this short story that I'm going to read to you now. So, without further ado, I present to you, and I hope you like it. Be gentle. The Spectre Haunting Jason Williams. The Spectre Haunting Jason Williams. Written by me. The first time Jason heard Gypsy by Fleetwood Mac, he was on the dance floor at his senior year homecoming, dancing with Allison. He had originally come with his small group of friends, the usual suspects: Dan, Tony, Mike. They had been sneaking liquor out of the back of Dan's Pontiac Firebird in the parking lot. The guys jokingly referred to the Firebird as the Fire Turd, because that car was a real jalopy. Allison had caught Jason's attention immediately. He had never seen her before, but in their high school, there were so many students and so many specialized classes that it wasn't unusual to pass by total strangers in the hallways. Her vibrant smile lit up the room, and her fire-red hair flowed around her head like effervescent clouds. "No balls," Tony chirped. Jason swung his head around to face Tony. "Excuse me." Tony motioned towards Allison with the small plastic cup containing some dubious substance or another that he was holding in his right hand. "You've been staring at her, but you don't have the balls to go talk to her." Jason contemplated what Tony had said for a second. Maybe he was right. Jason had never been the best when it came to women. Here he was as a 17-year-old, and he was still a virgin. The longest relationship he'd ever been in was with a girl named Riley in 2nd grade, and she didn't even know about it. Tony's right, Jason thought. I don't have it in me. In that moment, a song came on that Jason had never heard before. It started with a bouncy guitar riff and some piano keys. Then, the most beautifully haunting voice he had ever heard came through the speakers with an almost mystical quality to it. So I'm back to the velvet underground, back to the floor that I love. Jason looked over towards Allison and noticed that she was singing and dancing along to the song, allowing her body to flow effortlessly to the rhythm of the music. This is it. This is my sign. Jason stood and walked the floor toward her. He stood across from her and began to mimic her movements, mirroring her. She smiled and laughed and began to mouth the words along with the song. And you see your gypsy. You see your gypsy. 3 years of dating later, and Jason and Allison would be married. A year after that, and they would be welcoming their first child into the world, a beautiful and exuberant little ball of energy named Elizabeth. 2 years after that, and Jason finds himself where he does now, behind the wheel of his old pickup truck, winding through rural roads towards a destination he doesn't even know exists. Gypsy is blaring from the speakers. Every time he's heard it, he was reminded of her. So of course, he's continued to listen no matter how painful it was. Oh Lord, he would give anything to, in this moment, turn and see her sat beside him in the passenger seat with her head resting against the window like she liked to do. Of course, Elizabeth would be there as well, bouncing up and down, trying to see over the dashboard so she could yell out car or deer, any other observation she had of the outside world. The smell of crops burning lingered in the air and seeped through the vents into the cabin of Jason's truck. The pine trees lined so thickly the sides of the road that they appeared to form one large solid organism. Jason was sure that animals lurked there in those trees. Squirrels bounced from pine tree to pine tree while the deer below rutted down a new bed. Perhaps even predators like bears and cougars would stalk their prey through the thick flora. Animals like that used to scare Jason, but he had learned that more terrifying things existed than the sharp claws and gnashing teeth of animals like those. He had encountered them on his journey for answers. First he started with the neighbor. She always seemed innocent enough. Just a new age wannabe hippie who was too cool for traditional things like Jesus, so she turned to some spiritual bullshit. That's what he thought, at least, when Allison had begun to spend a little too much time with her. Then the chanting started in the altar. God, the fucking altar. He should have smashed that thing when he had the chance, but he thought it was just some phase Allison was going through. You're gonna tell me what you did with her, Jason stated as he secured the ropes, connecting her dainty wrists to the thick wooden arms of the chair she was sitting in. She did as she was willed to do. She spoke with the intonation of a person who is so entrenched in their beliefs that there was not a sliver of doubt in their mind that they were correct. wide grin splayed across her face taunted Jason with its sincerity. You poisoned her mind. She used to be normal. Jason spat at the woman with an anger so seething that if it held a physical form, it would be that of an instrument of death. Once she was blind, and now she can see. She looked Jason deep in the eyes to plead with him to see her truth. She was so unhappy, you have no idea. Finally, she can be free. If you love her, isn't that what you want? In that moment, a flood of crimson filled Jason's vision, and he allowed his rage to consume him. He snatched up the utility knife he'd used to cut the lengths of rope from the dusty shop floor, and slashed it across her torso over and over and over, as he screamed into her face the screams of a broken and desperate man. After many more moments of being consumed by the release that untethered violence finally brought to him, he dropped the blade and forced himself to take in the atrocity that he had just committed. Her body was unrecognizable from the mutilation. The only identifiable feature left was the scraps of her flowery sundress that remained hanging from her shoulders. What have I done? Jason struggled to find his breath as his anger was replaced by panic. I murdered a woman. I'm going to prison. He began to rush aimlessly from end to end of his shop, hoping that something to make all of this go away would just be hanging on the wall or stowed in his toolbox. Find the triangle. The voice was faint, as if spoken from lungs that contained no breath, but clearly feminine. Jason turned to see that she had risen in her seat, her head supported by what was left of her neck, and her eyes, which now were pale and white as polished marble, locked directly onto his. He felt his heart drop into his stomach, and his feet became lead as the fear froze him in place. She repeated again, "Find the triangle." Jason raised a cigarette to his lips and lit it. He allowed the smoke to fill his lungs before exhaling it through the sliver of space he allowed in the driver's side window. He had never been a smoker before, but these days he found it was the only way to slow his mind and steady his trembling hands. He adjusted the rearview mirror and for a split second caught his reflection. His hair was starting to prematurely gray from stress. His skin was pale and sickly from the time he spent indoors, slaving over research into the occult and other such things he used to discount as nonsense. A freshly healed scar decorated his left cheek. He had gotten that while fleeing the police station after stealing some old records that were instrumental in leading him towards his current destination. A perfectly triangle-shaped plot of land in the middle of nowhere that used to be a company-owned mine until some invisible force drove the miners away. That was, if you believe the old wives' tales, which Jason was starting to. Would Allison or Elizabeth even recognize him now? Would they welcome him with open arms as their savior, or run screaming in the opposite direction from the broken and scarred man who he had momentarily got the reflection of? That's when Jason saw it. The shape was so unnatural that his brain immediately rejected it as an illusion. 3 trees had been bent. No, impossible, they were bent. Surely they must have grown that way, into the shape of a triangle. One of the trunks formed the base, while the other two twisted together like a wooden pretzel and formed the sides. Quickly, Jason pulled off the road and exited his vehicle to get a closer look of the unnatural monument. Slowly, he approached the twisted vines. Everything in his entire being told him to run, but his feet were working against his better intentions and dragging him closer. He had to see. He had to get a better look. As he inched nearer, his body began to vibrate, almost as if he had an earthquake contained inside himself. His skin was electric, and he began to get dizzy. I need to lie down, Jason thought, and that's when he collapsed. The world slowly came back into existence as he opened his eyes. He rubbed them to see more clearly and slowly sat upright in the large bed. This was much nicer than his bed at home, and Jason didn't want to think about how much one of these must cost. The smell of warm sea air filled his nostrils, and the beating sunlight shone through the bamboo wall slats and illuminated the bedroom of the beachside bungalow. Just married, the large white banner decorating the wall stated, of course in glittery pink lettering. The bedroom door swung open and Allison floated in. She must have been awake for a while now because she had donned one of the complimentary, newlywed monogrammed bathrobes that the resort had supplied, and the smell of a fresh pot of coffee wafted into the room after her like a caffeine perfume. Finally, you're awake, sleepyhead. Allison giggled as she plopped down onto the bed on her hands and knees. Jason reached forward and ran his fingers through her hair. How long have you been awake? He groggily asked her. Oh, maybe an hour or so. Allison bounced back up off the bed and threw open the two large French doors that led from the bedroom to the dock. Let's go for a dip. Allison dropped the white robe from her shoulders and allowed it to bundle on the floor around her ankles. Jason's eyes traced her naked form, up her legs, past her hips into her back. That's where he saw it. In the center of her back, a large tattoo, the outline of a triangle situated between her shoulder blades. His breath caught in his chest and his heart skipped a beat. He couldn't look away from it, although he wanted nothing more than to do so. It was getting larger, expanding across her back and enveloping her entire body. Her form melted away and all that was left was the black triangle. Not black. Darker than that. A void of sheer nothingness that for some cruel reason had taken on the form of a geometric shape. The center of the triangle beckoned for Jason to step through it. He could hear it in his mind as if its voice were his own. Step through. It echoed through his head and overwrote his own thoughts in the process. As soon as the spark of an idea formed, it was devoured by the void that had now overtaken the entire room. Step through. No, Jason had been here before. This was a real memory. This isn't how things had gone. This was the night of their honeymoon, and Allison would step through the doors and dip her toe into the tropical waters before a small fish would brush against them and send her screaming back into the room. No tattoo, no triangle, Jason screamed out. "No," he screamed again. But the warm tropical air was no longer in his lungs, and was instead replaced by the crisp and dew-filled forest breeze. He was lying on his back now, staring up at the clouds, but he couldn't remember how he got that way. Surely he must have fainted, but he couldn't shake the visceral feeling that filled every fiber of his being. It all felt so vivid and real. He was certain he could still taste the salt on the back of his tongue, and if he thought hard enough, he could still feel the wetness from Allison's freshly washed hair on his fingertips. Overwhelmed with emotion, he felt tears begin to well up in his eyes, but he quickly pushed them away with the back of his hand. Now was not the time. Jason got to his feet and turned to face the tree triangle. But where once it stood, now there was nothing. He knew there was no way he was hallucinating. The ungodly shape had been there just a moment before. He was certain of that. The trees were still there, yes, rooted in the same position he had seen them before. But they were standing tall and true as any other pine tree in any other forest would be. Unsure of what else to do, he ran to the passenger door of his truck and flung it open. Resting on the seat, hidden beneath an old denim jacket, was his father's duty pistol from when he was a police officer. Good, Jason thought. Some infernal force hasn't taken this from me. He secured the pistol awkwardly in his waistband of his jeans and marched towards the tree line. He had found the triangle. Allison and Elizabeth must be close. Jason had been walking for what felt like hours. The soles of his feet had gone numb and his legs burned from the strain he had placed upon them. He might as well have been walking in circles because as far as Jason could discern, all the trees looked the same and he was going nowhere fast. A downed tree rested on the ground, and Jason allowed himself to collapse down onto it. I'm such a fool, Jason thought. He had hung on to the words of a dying woman in a vain attempt to justify his actions and absolve himself of sins. He had become obsessed with symbols and pictograms in ancient languages that had been abandoned centuries ago, all the while destroying whatever interpersonal relationships he had left, just because he was incapable of accepting the reality that his wife and daughter were gone and they weren't coming back. His psychologist had told him as much time and time again. It's denial, Dr. Adams would say, peeping over the top of his round spectacles. You can't accept that your actions drove your wife away, so you've created a false narrative. It's more common than you'd think. Of course it was his fault. He was the one who had committed infidelity and broken the trust between them. Allison had tried her best to forgive him, bless her heart. He knew he didn't deserve her, but nothing was the same. Allison was physically and emotionally distant after that, and what little intimacy there was between them felt forced and awkward. A coldness and paranoia consumed them both over time, and as Jason sat on his hard wooden seat, tears filled his eyes as he came to understand the harsh reality of his situation. He had entered the life of this charismatic and caring woman like a gale wind, and in a few short years turned her into a husk of her former self. As the blue and white swirls danced across the teardrops in his eyes, Jason began to hear a distant sound. A faint droning echoing through the trees. He couldn't make out any distinct noises, but there was something there, he knew it. His heart began to pound in his chest as the noise got louder and louder. He began to hear syllables as it echoed through the trees and bounced from the bark to his eardrums. It had the grammatical structure of a language, but not one he could even begin to discern. It was guttural and alien to his ear. He had to go to them, he had to know. Internally, Jason was screaming with the instinctual response one would have when face to face with a tiger or some other sort of killer beast. Just leave. But he had to go, he had to know the truth. Jason broke into a sprint towards the source of the noise. He brushed aside slapping branches with his arms as vines and twigs slashed at his ankles. He broke through the tree line and stopped dead in his tracks as he came out into a clearing and set his eyes upon the scene before him. At the center of the clearing was a large stone pedestal. Set atop the pedestal was a gigantic triangle carved of a stone so black it seemed to absorb the light entering the clearing, making the space noticeably darker. Surrounding the pedestal were 24 or so figures, adorning robes of a similar color, and these figures were the source of the noise. The same 4 syllables escaped their lips rhythmically time and time again. An eldritch gibbering that bounced off every tree, filling the triangle-shaped clearing with its presence. He hesitated for a moment, then fumbled the handgun from his waistband and slowly inched towards the figure closest to him. He reached out with a trembling hand and slowly inched the hood down to reveal the face of an elderly man beneath. Upon closer inspection, Jason noted that his skin hung from his bones like a corpse, and his eyes were entirely white and empty of life. Yet his mouth moved, and the sounds continued to come from him. Jason continued to the next figure, and the next, until across the way from him he noticed a figure much smaller than the rest. He froze in place and stared for a long while. No. Apprehensively, he approached. His feet felt heavy, and he drug through the tall grass as he inched ever closer to the figure he hoped was not who he believed it to be. Not like this. With a shaky hand, he reached toward the hem of the hood and gripped it. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath and lifted it. Jason opened his eyes, and what he saw before him shook him to the core. It was Elizabeth, he was certain of it. Her skin hung from her bones like all the others he had looked upon before her, and Jason could see the veins beneath her skin, and they were dry as a bone. She opened her decrepit mouth empty of teeth, and uttered that same goddamn noise. Jason grabbed her shoulders and began to shake her vigorously. Lizzie. Lizzie, wake up. It's Daddy. Daddy's here to save you. His voice was a futile plea to the universe, as her body moved limply under his force. The once sparkling blue eyes of his beautiful daughter were now a misty white nothingness that offered no response. Jason stood and faced the monolith towering before him. Damn you. He raised the pistol and fired 2 rounds into the black stone. They didn't ricochet. They didn't chip it. It appeared as though nothing had happened at all as the bullets impacted the idol. They merely phased out of existence. Jason's body began to vibrate, and his skin felt electric. The first time Jason heard Gypsy by Fleetwood Mac, he was on the dance floor at his senior year homecoming dancing with Allison. He had originally come with his small group of friends, the usual suspects, Dan, Tony, Mike. They had been sneaking liquor out of the back of Dan's Pontiac Firebird in the parking lot. The guys jokingly referred to the Firebird as the Fire Turd, because that car was a real jalopy. Allison had caught Jason's attention immediately. He had never seen her before, but in their high school there were so many students and so many specialized classes that it wasn't unusual to pass by total strangers in the hallways. Her vibrant smile lit up the room, and her fire-red hair flowed around her head like effervescent clouds. "You'll never be able to save her," Tony chirped. Jason swung his head around to face Tony. "Excuse me?" Tony's eyes locked with Jason's immediately. "You will fight." "Oh, you will fight. But you will fail. And you will always fail." Jason stared at him. This isn't how the dance went. Tony was supposed to tease Jason and then he'd get up and go dance with Allison. And then they would start dating and they would get married and then she would get pregnant and then Elizabeth would be born and Elizabeth. He had to go save Elizabeth. He looked to the dance floor where he knew Allison was supposed to be, and there she was. Jason rose from his seat and ran to Allison on the dance floor. He grabbed her shoulder and spun her around to face him. And as she faced him, she uttered the same noise that Elizabeth had, along with all the other figures in the clearing before her. Jason took a step back in shock. She stepped towards him to close the gap. She continued to repeat the phrase, and it echoed all around him. Slowly, the syllables became recognizable to his ear. "Step through." "No," Jason whispered under his breath. "Step through." And as the words left Allison's mouth, her eyes went white, and her vibrant red hair transitioned to a dull and listless gray. Her eyes locked onto his, and Jason was incapable of looking away. The white glow was mesmerizing and oddly comforting. He felt a warmth fill his being, and his surroundings became white as he became physically lost in her eyes. He felt weightless in that moment, floating through an infinite white space. He was not scared, however, for he knew he was where he was supposed to be. Rising before him and then hovering in place was the large black triangle from before. However, it looked different this time. Instead of a hollow center, there was a pulsating, real slick. A resonating hum came from somewhere deep within the void, and it was a lullaby beckoning Jason to come closer. He floated towards it. He needed to know what was through that space ahead, for something paradisiacal truly must lay on the other side. The thought of it plagued his thoughts, and he was unable to shake it. He had visions of the most magnificent and indescribable vistas, and deep down he knew that's where Allison and Elizabeth must be, and in that place they would share salvation, a personal Shangri-La. He had been searching, and finally he was here. Step through. And he did. And on the other side he saw what he had been seeking, and in return had been seeking him. He stood in the awesome glory of its presence. It was formless and filled the void. Its appearance was blasphemous to the very laws of physics and nature that Jason understood from all of his earthly experience. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, with twisting tendrils formed of an endless black matter. At the center of those tendrils lay a mouth formed into the shape of a triangle. Marvu, Jason spoke against his will, and in that moment he understood that word to be the name of the entity, an ageless being that had formed before time, and existed both outside the universe and inside the minds of broken men. Step through, he then spoke again, and the tendrils pulled him closer. Jason was inches from the geometric mouth now, and through the constantly grinding teeth, he was able to make out forms there in the blackness. One, a beautiful woman with flowing red hair, floating about her face as if suspended in water. And beside her, a little blonde girl beckoning for her father to join them in eternity. Step through. Jason uttered it, and he felt a warm embrace in the cold, uncaring world. Allison extended her hand to him, welcoming him to join her and redeem himself. He reached out to meet her hand with his own, and in that moment, her hand was gone, and so was she. And Elizabeth was gone as well. All that remained was the teeth and the tendrils, and the promise they brought. A promise that not even Jason could break. The promise of eternal slumber, with no hope to wake. So that was, The Spectre Haunting Jason Williams. That was my short story. I hope you guys did like it. I'm a little bit self-conscious putting out a piece of my written work into the world, something I am quite proud of, but, yeah, I hope you guys found the story interesting, or at least the video relaxing, but thank you so much for watching regardless. If you did like the video, please leave a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel for more content just like this, almost every single day. Until next time, guys. Bye-bye.